Sometimes I find myself thinking about the Blue Ball Machine. It's an old favorite of mine. A collaborative art project on an internet forum. The artist's long since forgone by its audience. It's a bizarre contraption. Balls are broken, reformed, changed, exchanged, reborn. All is created. All is destroyed. It reminds me of the universe in a weird way. A machine that carries the aesthetic of purpose but has none, that chews us up and spits us out, forever recycling our atoms to create life anew as the old fades away. A never-ending cycle of creation and destruction, perpetuated by sheer instinct.
This video is about theme parks, by the way.
The themed entertainment industry was growing in the 80s and 90s. From regional amusement parks to themed restaurants, there was a lot of demand. Restaurant concepts like Chuck E. Cheese, which combined dining with an arcade and animatronic shows, had spawned into existence a new market of family entertainment centers. Indoor spaces that offered a variety of small attractions for families to enjoy. Obstacle courses, sky tubes, arcade games, and more were common. Vendors began designing and installing all sorts of off-the-shelf attractions, and with that came an even bigger wave of popularity. Owners of museums, go-karting tracks, regional parks, and fast food chains started buying these designs as well. It became an affordable way to add a new family-accessible attraction to a space, and for that reason, they became ubiquitous. Yes, I was born into the golden age of the McDonald's Play Place. And in the middle of the Play Place gold rush, a man named Rick Briggs had an idea. Rick Briggs was the founder. Hang on.
I said was just there because we're still in the past, not because he's dead. He's not.
Rick Briggs was the founder of SCS Interactive, a water park attraction vendor that had many inventions to its name. Yes, they're the big bucket people. And in 1986, they invented water. And as the Play Place boom hit the market, they stepped up and contributed many of their own designs. Slides, obstacle courses, the usual. And then in 1996, Briggs and his team would hit upon a concept that would inadvertently lead to a YouTube video being made 30 years later. They would patent and release the Foam Factory. The concept goes like this. Dump a bunch of foam balls on the ground. Now, move them around in as many ways as possible. Shoot them from cannons, suck them up into a tank, spray them out of a fountain, and of course dump them out of a big bucket. You gotta play the hits. All of this is a good start, but what elevates the concept is the next bit, the catwalk. Foam Factory isn't a single-story experience, no. It requires a catwalk to work. This adds verticality to the space, introducing more elements for shuffling balls between the two floors, and most crucially, divides the guests into two factions, those above and those below. The above have stronger armaments as well as the high ground. The below have the ammunition and the advantage of space.
Were you an above kid or a below kid? I need to know before we can be friends.
The Foam Factory was radical, a highly interactive take on many of the ideas already prevalent in family entertainment attractions that had a lot of opportunities for narrative play as well as good old-fashioned manipulables. There were a variety of standard configurations available, in addition to custom installations in any combination of the primary components. And let's run down those components. You can broadly split them into three categories: blasters, fountains, and transport. Blasters let you pretend that getting hit by a foam ball at overhand speed counts as violence. Fountains let you collect a bunch of balls and send them flying, and transports let you move balls between the different levels, or collect them for use in one of the other components. To shake things up, there was the Auto Blaster, which was positioned on the catwalk but could be installed to be fed from the ground, which would require an alliance between the two factions. There was also the Banana Blaster, which was sort of like taking the worst parts of a blaster and the worst parts of a fountain and combining them into the absolute worst thing in the room. And of course, many more components could be dreamt up.
It was an instant success. Not only was it inexpensive and compact, but it was also exciting and could be themed elaborately. Everyone wanted a Foam Factory. Entertainment centers, museums, even amusement parks saw the potential.
SCS got into the business of designing larger, themed models for clients like Six Flags and Cedar Fair. Most of these stuck to the factory concept for their theming, Valley Fair's even going all in on the foam ball aspect before eventually being renamed to match Cedar Fair's other copies, despite not retheming the interior. They even made it into Universal Studios with the opening of Curious George Goes to Town in 1998, which is still operating to this day, relatively speaking. But where I first fell in love was in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. In 1952, Bob and Ruth Morell were introduced to German toymaker Frau Edith von Arps, who sold the couple a large collection of handmade dolls based on fairy tales and nursery rhymes. Sensing a business opportunity, she suggested they open a theme park based on the stories the dolls drew inspirations from, as a way to create an American distributor for her work.
That's actually the story. I refuse to believe that conversation happened. What a goddamn salesman.
They took her advice, and just a year before Walt Disney would open his own park in 1955, Storyland was open for business. The park continued to grow in the decades following, becoming a beloved local institution. Things continued swiftly in this fashion until 1999, when they decided to install a foam factory in this covered dome they just had lying around. It had been lying around because it was once the show building for the park's only dark ride, Voyage to the Moon, but that isn't relevant to this discussion. And just kidding, we need to talk about this dark ride. Okay, so the year is 1980, and they decide it's time to build a dark ride. It's called Voyage to the Moon. The story follows that you're being fired into space from a cannon, and the ride vehicle looks like a bullet. That's not really how bullets work, but it's fine. It's Jules Verne inspired, I get it. What happens next? We get into space and immediately we're sucked into a black hole and lose contact with mission control. And then we meet a friendly wizard who— a wizard! The wizard tells us he can make our dreams come true and invites us to join him as we encounter a wide variety of wacky creatures, from worrywurtles to everyone's favorite, Chugga Chugga Puff Puff. There's also a couple of robots mining some crystals, but they look busy, so let's not disturb them. The wizard then grants our wish as we enter a world made entirely out of candy, that for whatever reason has a giant flying pair of Rocky Horror lips, and a Dixieland house band. And then we have to watch out for Mr. Blowhard, because he's in the ride too, you know. And then we meet the floaters, because they're here as well. And of course, you gotta have Sally the singing sea serpent. It's a voyage to the moon after all. Then the wizard decides we're done and sends us home to reflect on the experience. I remind you that this ride was called Voyage to the Moon.
In the description, I've linked a video by ThemeParks&Me that makes a much more serious attempt at documenting this ride. Please appreciate it with me. It is insane, but it is marvelous.
The ride was extremely popular, which was bad because it had a very low hourly capacity. Eventually, after years of high wait times and wizard-induced blood sugar spikes, the aging ride was deemed too expensive to repair for how few guests it could hold, and the decision was made to retire the attraction. We now rejoin the original topic of this video, already in progress. Storyland would open their new foam factory, Professor Bigglestep's Loopy laboratory, to immediate success. The space also featured an interactive stage show where kids could help the professor launch a rocket, in a nod to the building's former tenant. Over the years, the show would be phased out, as would the professor's name, but the Loopy lab exists to this day.
I visited Storyland a few times as a kid, and I was obsessed with the lab. There was something about it that just clicked in my brain. It was impossible to get me to leave. I remember visiting Universal for the first time and being blown away that they had one too. Of course, so did everyone else, but I didn't know that yet.
SCS Interactive would eventually be sold to Koala Incorporated, these guys, in 2000 as part of their Koala Play amusement division, which would soon take the SCS name for itself. Koala overinvested in this division and eventually hit some hard times, leading them to sell it off to water park company Whitewater West, who had already made several licensing deals with SCS in the past. They placed it under their Prime Play division, later Prime Interactive, later Whitewater Attractions, later non-existent. At some point in its history, two spin-off attractions were created. Ballocity, which appears to be the same thing except inside a larger shoes-off play structure, and Fusion Factory, which combined the standard components with laser tag and other technological play features. I can't find any indication that Whitewater West still sells Foam Factory, as the last time their attractions brand seemed to exist was in 2016. The Foam Factory patents eventually expired, and nowadays you can buy most of the components for cheap overseas. Rick Briggs would go on to start a few more companies, most involving water parks, interactive play, or both. I probably could have thrown a dart at his career and found a good video wherever I looked. He's a legitimate all-star. His current company, Infinite Kingdoms, proudly credits itself with inventing the Big Bucket. Something I find interesting is the insistent terminology around this attraction. Even the themed ones almost always stuck to the factory concept, despite the open-ended nature of the components. And much like the blue ball machine from several minutes ago, these factories just spin on their axles, shooting and sucking and blowing and dumping and moving balls around forever. Nothing ever gets produced. Nothing ever ships out. The factory is but an energy drain, tempting entropy with its wastefulness. One of the only ones I found to explicitly break this theme was the Loopy lab, which instead interpreted the machinery and kinetic energy of the space as experiments, wacky side projects of an eccentric professor. And you know what? I think that's a more apt analogy. It's a place for children to experiment. They discover the physics of the world around them. They experience cause and effect. They navigate social landscapes as they engage in imaginative play. They leave just a little bit more engaged with the world around them. Perhaps that's what the factory was really building.
And that's about it. A 90s restaurant fad led to a demand for indoor attractions. The foam factory stepped up to meet the demand. And 20 years later, here we are. I don't know how many exist in the world. I don't know how many continue to be installed. But I know that the ones we have are special. And we should cherish them while they're still here. And I also know that above kids can go and